Winter 1856, Columbus, Ohio. Two horses stood in a public stockyard nobody wanted to get near. The crowd gathered anyway. Word had gotten around that a quiet, unremarkable farmer from nearby Groveport had asked for a turn with them. These were animals so surly, so genuinely dangerous, that the men who'd been trying to handle them had mostly given up trying. He didn't carry a whip. He didn't bring a second man to help hold anyone back. 20 minutes later, the first horse stood calm. 15 minutes after that, so did the second. The crowd went home that afternoon talking about a name most of them had never heard before that day: John Solomon Rarey. What none of them knew yet was that this quiet Ohio farmer already had his sights set on a country 3,000 miles away, and on an animal there so far gone that its own owner had seriously considered blinding it just to make it safe to be near. This is farm lore, where we tell the kind of stories the land doesn't let go of easily. We go looking for these stories so you don't have to. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe so the next one finds you. And before we go any further, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I read everyone. And if you're already curious to see how this one ends, hit the like button. Now let's go back further still, to a quiet Ohio farm and a boy with no playmates his own age, who found his only real friendships standing in a pasture. John Solomon Rarey was born December 6, 1827, in Groveport, a small farming settlement in Franklin County, Ohio. By one account, he was born in a brick tavern his own father had built to replace an older family structure on the same land. The Rareys were working people, rooted to one piece of ground for generations, the kind of family that rebuilt rather than moved on. Groveport in the 1820s was still frontier enough that a boy without brothers close to his own age and without neighbors within easy walking distance might simply grow up without playmates at all. That was John's situation. Rather than suffer for it, he turned to the only companionship actually available to him: the animals themselves, and especially the horses. It was not a gentle education. He was drawn to horses from a very young age, and by 12 he was already attempting to train them. This was dangerous work for a grown man, let alone a child with no formal instruction and no one to teach him a safer way. The family doctor, according to accounts passed down through Rarey's own relatives, was called out to the farm 3 separate times to deal with fractures and dislocations the boy suffered along the way. Rarey himself, years later, standing in front of a paying audience in New York at the height of his fame, described those years without any apparent embarrassment. He'd broken nearly every bone in his body, he told them, except his right arm. He'd been young enough each time that the bones healed strong. He wasn't hiding the cost of the education. He offered it up almost as proof of how seriously he'd taken the work. What he was building, alone in an Ohio pasture with no name for it yet, was a genuinely radical idea for its time. That a horse didn't need to be broken through force to be made safe and useful. It could be reached, understood, persuaded rather than defeated. Nobody around him was teaching this. Across America and Europe, both in the 1830s and 40s, the standard method for handling a difficult horse was force. The whip, the spur, a prolonged contest of will that ended only once the animal's spirit had been thoroughly subdued. Rarey was quietly working out something else entirely, mostly through his own broken bones and his own patience, with no one to tell him whether it would ever amount to anything. By his 20s, word of his ability had started to spread through his own community, not through any effort of his own, but through farmers who'd brought him a horse nobody else could handle and had it handed back to them calm. By 25, he'd already written his first book on the subject and had started giving lessons to anyone willing to pay attention. In 1855, Rarey decided Ohio wasn't going to be enough of a proving ground. He traveled south and west, into Kentucky and then Texas, to work directly with wild plains horses. These were animals that had never known a human hand at all, a wholly different test than a farm horse gone difficult through bad treatment. It was demanding, unglamorous work. He proved genuinely skilled at it. He did not, however, make much money doing it, and after a real financial struggle out on the plains, he made his way back home to central Ohio. That return home is where the real proving ground happened. Not quietly this time, in public, in front of witnesses whose accounts survive today. At the Ohio stage yards in Columbus, Rarey was handed those two surly, belligerent horses in front of a skeptical public crowd and gentled both, back to back, in under 25 minutes combined. Word spread quickly through Ohio and beyond. Rarey began teaching others what he knew and published a modest, self-funded lesson pamphlet to raise money for an ambition that must have sounded, to most of his neighbors, close to delusional. He intended to take this same skill to England, where the horse was king, and win there the recognition America hadn't yet given him. He reached Liverpool on November 29, 1857. One description of him from that arrival survives almost word for word. About 5 feet 9 inches tall, delicately built, light-haired, light-complexioned, with intelligent gray eyes and an open, unguarded face. Nothing about his appearance suggested the reputation he was about to build. Rarey didn't walk straight into London demanding an audience with anyone important. He understood, correctly, that his American reputation meant nothing yet on English soil. He partnered first with a Canadian businessman who arranged demonstrations in front of British military officers stationed in Canada. Those officers were impressed enough to write home to their fellow officers in England about what they'd seen. Word moved the way real reputations tend to move, quietly, through people whose judgment other people already trusted. Eventually, it reached Sir Richard Airy, one of the finest soldiers on his staff, who arranged for Rarey to work through a series of genuinely difficult horses. One by one, Rarey gentled them. That was enough. Within 2 months of his arrival, Rarey was working with horses belonging to the English royal family itself, and particularly impressed his patrons by taming a difficult colt owned by Prince Albert. Queen Victoria, delighted, requested repeat performances, and eventually invited Rarey to attend the wedding of her eldest daughter, the Princess Royal, an extraordinary gesture, placing an American farmer in the middle of one of the most significant royal social events of the year. What Queen Victoria and her entourage watched in those early demonstrations bordered on theatrical. Rarey laid a horse down on the ground. He lay beside it himself, resting his head against its leg, crawling over its body and through its legs. He opened an umbrella and shook it directly around the animal's head, exactly the kind of sudden motion that would have sent this same horse into a panic only minutes earlier. He had it stand, climbed onto its back, and beat a drum while sitting there. The horse remained completely passive through every part of it. The Queen, by every surviving account, dissolved into genuine laughter and gave Rarey a monetary gift on the spot. He set up a paid subscription lecture series on his methods. The Queen signed up personally. So did 2,000 others. All of this happened within Rarey's first 2 months in the country. But not everyone in England was impressed, and the men's opinion actually threatened his reputation weren't in any royal court at all. The ordinary horsemen of England, grooms, trainers, breeders who'd spent entire careers handling difficult horses the old way, through dominance and force, largely dismissed Rarey's demonstrations as an elaborate trick or simple luck performed for an audience too enchanted or too polite to accept hard questions. For a great many of them, it was genuinely easier to believe an American had somehow charmed his way past a gullible nobility than to accept that his method actually worked. Word of the American trainer's skill kept spreading through the English peerage until it reached Sir Guy Carleton, the Earl of Dorchester, who came to Rarey seeking help for a horse he owned that was, by that point, considered beyond helping. The horse's name was Cruiser. Not long before, he'd been something close to magnificent. A large, dark bay stallion, mixed with black, sired by venison, standing 16 hands high. At 2 years old, he was said to be the fastest horse in all of England, with real hope he might become one of the great racehorses of his generation. Something changed. The accounts don't agree precisely on what. Rough handling, an untreated injury, simple, untreated temperament. But Cruiser became, over time, completely uncontrollable, too unruly to race. He would attack his own grooms, who'd taken to defending themselves with pitchforks just to get near him. He wore an iron and leather muzzle permanently, restrictive enough that he could only drink or eat by taking small licks through a narrow bar, unable to fully open his jaw for years at a stretch. This wasn't casual cruelty. It was the only method anyone had found to keep him from seriously hurting or killing whoever came near him. He lived essentially imprisoned behind a bolted stable door, kept alive only on the faint hope that he might eventually calm enough to be useful purely for breeding. It had been suggested, in complete seriousness, by people who believed they were proposing mercy rather than mutilation, that the kindest remaining option might be to take his eyesight. The reasoning was that a horse who no longer could see people approaching might finally stop attacking them out of sheer terror. If Mr. Rarey can tame him, I feel certain no horse can withstand his art, Dorchester wrote. Rarey accepted the challenge. No first-hand account of exactly what happened between Rarey and Cruiser has survived intact, and the recollections that do exist don't fully agree with each other. But the outline is consistent enough across enough sources to trust the shape of it. Rarey arrived at Dorchester's estate and went to Cruiser's stall directly. He was not physically an imposing man, 5'9", 167 pounds, reddish hair, snug European-cut clothing, a quiet, watchful manner. Nothing about his appearance suggested he belonged anywhere near an animal that had already savaged the men who cared for him. He had the muzzle removed and positioned himself just outside the stall, behind a half-door topped with an iron bar. When Cruiser lunged at him, Rarey moved his arm so the horse's teeth met iron instead. Cruiser lunged again and again, attacking something that gave him nothing back, exhausting himself against it over and over until there was simply nothing left to fight with. Only then did Rarey open the door and go in. For 3 hours, no one else was present. What we do know from what Rarey eventually revealed about his broader technique once he stopped guarding it as a trade secret is roughly what tools he had at his disposal, even if we can't say for certain how he used them that specific afternoon. His core method involved strapping one of a horse's legs up against its own body, then gently pushing the animal off balance until, unable to fight on 3 legs the way it could on 4, it lay down. Once down, Rarey would stroke the horse everywhere, over and over, proving to the animal that even in this position of total vulnerability, nothing bad was going to happen to it. He'd let it back up, lay it down again. Repeat until something in the horse's own understanding of danger began to shift. Whatever happened behind that door, it worked completely. 3 hours after Rarey went in, both he and Dorchester could handle and ride the same stallion that had spent years unrideable and unapproachable. The following morning, by Dorchester's own account, Rarey led Cruiser behind an open carriage on the road to London, calm as any farm horse. Dorchester was so moved by what he'd witnessed that he gave Rarey the horse outright. Rarey's business partnership with his original Canadian sponsor ended not long after, but he had a new partner now. Cruiser became the living proof at the center of every demonstration Rarey gave from that day forward. Rarey's fame, already considerable in England, became something close to genuine global celebrity after Cruiser. He toured widely: France, Sweden, Germany, Russia, Norway, Egypt, Turkey, Arabia, performing before enormous crowds who'd heard some version of the Cruiser story and wanted to see the man behind it with their own eyes. For a stretch of years, he was arguably the most famous horse trainer alive, reportedly earning as much as $100,000 a year. That was an almost unimaginable sum for a farmer's son from rural Ohio. The horses brought to him weren't only difficult farm animals or racing stallions anymore either. Owners across Europe, chasing the same transformation they'd heard about with Cruiser, presented him with rearing draft horses, biting carriage ponies, animals nobody local wanted to touch. At one point, he was even asked to work with a zebra. Rarey took the job. Whatever it was he actually understood about frightened, defensive animals, it apparently wasn't limited to one species, one country, or one famous horse. Not everyone believed it, even watching it directly. Accusations followed Rarey for years, that he used hidden potions, that he dripped wax into a horse's ear to dull its senses, that whatever this was couldn't possibly be simple technique and must instead be some form of witchcraft. For a lot of people, it remained genuinely easier to believe in magic or fraud than in the plain, unglamorous idea that patience alone could accomplish something force had failed at for years. Rarey eventually stopped guarding his methods as a secret at all. In the beginning, he'd trained clients privately, sworn them to silence, sold his knowledge as an exclusive subscription lecture series. Over time, he came to believe the value of spreading the knowledge outweighed whatever exclusivity it cost him, and he published his methods openly in a book still freely available to read today. Once revealed, the secret turned out to be exactly what it looked like from the outside. Not potions, not the occult, understanding. Rarey had spent his childhood learning to read a horse's body language the way another person might learn a second language. He recognized what triggered fear, what calmed it, and instinctively checked for old injuries that might explain a violent reaction nobody else had bothered to investigate. The writer Ralph Waldo Emerson watched him work and struggled afterward to describe what he'd seen in ordinary terms. Watching Rarey, Emerson wrote, felt like watching something out of an Aesop fable come to life. Rarey, he said, had turned a new leaf in civilization. In early January of 1861, less than 3 months before the first shots of the Civil War would be fired at Fort Sumter, Rarey brought Cruiser to New York and gave a series of demonstrations at Niblo's Garden Theater in Lower Manhattan. On the first night, more than 2,000 people gathered outside, eager to look at the most celebrated horse trainer alive. Police had to shout orders just to keep the crowd controlled as the doors finally opened. Inside, the stage had been dressed as a simple stable, hay and sawdust laid thick across the floor. Rarey walked out to thunderous applause. On his command, Cruiser bounded across the stage toward him. The horse who had once savaged his own grooms, who'd worn an iron muzzle for years, whose own owner had once seriously entertained the idea of blinding him, that horse nuzzled Rarey affectionately, lowered his head, and the two of them wheeled and spun together across the stage, in front of a crowd that whistled and stamped their approval. When the Civil War actually broke out that spring, Rarey didn't stay home tending his fame. He enlisted and was assigned to evaluate horses for the Union Army under Major General Henry Halleck, work that put his particular expertise to use in a setting with none of the glamour of a European court. He used the position to argue for something that mattered to him as much as any royal demonstration ever had. Every man permitted to ride a horse, Rarey said, should be compelled by duty, if he lacked the humanity to do it on his own, to see that the horse received every care it was possible to give. It was the same conviction that had carried him through a Columbus stockyard and a locked English stable, applied now to army horses in wartime, with considerably less applause and considerably higher stakes. Rarey never got the long career his talent seemed to promise. 8 months after the war ended, he suffered a stroke. He seemed, for a while, to recover, and traveled the country afterward with his niece, hoping the change of scenery might help him heal fully. Then one day in October of 1866, on a visit to Cleveland, Ohio, he went out for a walk, came home early complaining that his head hurt, and was dead within the hour and 20 minutes that followed. He was 38 years old. In his final arrangements, he left specific instructions for how Cruiser was to be cared for once he was gone. A last, careful act of the same deliberate patience he'd built his entire reputation on. For a while, it worked. A few years later, a reporter found a woman named Mrs. Jones tending the old stallion, who lived peacefully in a field alongside a group of Shetland ponies, and came when she called him, gentle as he'd been on that stage in Manhattan. But something in Cruiser had been specific to Rarey, and it doesn't seem to have simply transferred to anyone willing to hold the lead rope. Some who knew the horse in those later years said that without the one particular man who'd reached him, his temper slowly began to return. Cruiser died in 1875, 9 years after Rarey. The New York Times ran an obituary for him, an honor rarely given to a horse and one usually reserved for those judged to have genuinely mattered to the world. Rarey's own name faded far faster than his methods did. Today, in his hometown of Groveport, Ohio, one of the most visible remaining links to him is a local high school football team built on the site of his old family property, whose players still call themselves, for reasons most of them likely couldn't fully explain, the Cruisers. His book is still there too, for anyone who wants to check any of this for themselves, still readable in his own words more than a century and a half later. But what Rarey actually proved, first in a Columbus stockyard, then behind a bolted stable door in England, then again in the middle of a war, never disappeared at all. It quietly became the foundation of an entire modern tradition. Where pain and intimidation were once the unquestioned standard for handling horses, Rarey demonstrated, publicly and repeatedly, that there was another way. His methods helped push horse training toward an idea that seems obvious to many people now, that understanding an animal's fear can accomplish what force cannot. Most people who train a horse gently today, who talk a spooked animal down instead of striking it, have no idea they're standing on the far end of a chain that started with a lonely farm boy in Ohio, breaking nearly every bone in his own body, learning to listen instead of fight. Have you ever watched something everyone around you had already agreed was a lost cause and wondered whether the real problem was the thing itself or just that nobody had found the right way to reach it yet? I think anyone who's ever stayed patient with a person, an animal, or a piece of ground everyone else had written off already knows something of what Rarey spent his whole life proving. This is Farm Lore, where we tell the kind of stories the land doesn't let go of easily. If a story like this one stayed with you, subscribe so the next one finds you the same way this one did. And tell me in the comments what you took from it and where in the world you're watching from. I read every one. Thank you for spending this time with me.